Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Mary and Minor Cook Virtual Athenaeum. My name is Chris Agard, and I'm one of your three Ath Fellows. How do you define happiness? Do you consider yourself happy? What makes you happy? How do you stay happy? I'm sure every single person in the audience will answer each of these questions differently, but I think it's fair to say that in one way or another, we are all in the pursuit of happiness. It turns out there are ways to make this pursuit more attainable. Psychology offers a great deal of information and insight to help us understand happiness and ways in which we can sustain the sensation and maintain a happy state of mind. Today's speaker is a leader in this realm of psychology that focuses specifically on well-being, curiosity, psychological flexibility, and resilience. Professor Todd Kashdan is a professor of psychology and director of the Wellbeing Laboratory at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, whose research includes a focus on happiness from the psychological perspective. The author of several books, Professor Kashdan has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles, and his work has been cited over 30,000 times. His research is featured regularly in a broad range of media outlets such as The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, New York Times, NPR, and Time Magazine. He is a keynote speaker and consultant for organizations as diverse as Microsoft, Mercedes-Benz, Prudential, General Mills, and the United States Department of Defense. In 2013, Professor Kashdan received the American Psychological Association Award for Distinguished Scientific Early Career Contributions to Psychology. Professor Kashdan's Athenaeum Talk is part of a three-part series on interdisciplinary perspectives on happiness, co-sponsored by the Berger Institute at CMC. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send in a question, please state your affiliation with the college, student, faculty, parent, alumni, or friend. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Todd Kashdan to the Athenaeum.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks, Chris, for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. I wish I could see the other two talks of the perspectives on happiness. I think this is a really useful approach, which is there's economic approaches, philosophical approaches, sociological approaches, and you're going to see a great deal of overlap as I offer a psychological approach. And I should probably say from the get-go that I'm going to be synthesizing a body of work of a lot of my colleagues, and possibly none of this is my own work. I just chose the best work that's out there, which I do not believe was mine. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to answer everything you could ever want to know about happiness for your entire livelihood in 30 to 40 minutes, because that's easy. A psychological lens for understanding happiness. What I want to do in less than 40 minutes is tell you about what science has to say about what happiness is, about what are the barriers to get in the way of accomplishing happiness, and then how do we overcome those barriers and actually acquire not just happiness, because that's actually pretty easy. The hard thing is how do we increase our level of happiness and sustain it at a high level. So I should probably tell you, and I just looked this up literally an hour ago at my daughter's soccer practice, that the self-help happiness industry, literally $9 billion right now. And here's just a sampling of some of my colleagues' books on happiness. If I had to tell you one of these books to pick up, I would probably say Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis, but don't tell the other authors because they're all friends of mine. I do want to draw your attention to the horrendous book at the bottom right, which is You Can Be the Wife of a Happy Husband. Sold over millions of copies, this sexist trope, and still exists on Amazon today. And the reason that I want to kind of begin with just a few holdings of these large treaties on happiness is that there's something wrong here. If you've got a $9 billion industry on happiness, if you've got all these books that are coming out in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, up to today, and you're still trying to tell people what are the secrets that science has to offer about happiness, clearly they haven't figured it out properly yet. and there needs to be a little bit more intellectual humility in terms of what we know, what we think we know, and what we don't know. Now, as this $9 billion industry happens, let's look at some data that's been collected from the 50s to 2000s. So every single year, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago collects data from thousands of people, and they're able to actually ascertain over the course of time how has income changed in the past 50, 60 years. And controlling for inflation, now, by the way, don't get scared by the y-axis here. This is in dollars in 1995. So counting for inflation, the average person's salary in the United States has increased substantially. Now, the question is, as our country focuses on gross domestic product, every single day there's a Dow Jones index, and every day people think about how much wealth they have. The question is, as we become more of an affluent society, which is not for everyone, but on average, we're becoming more affluent over time, what's happening to the percentage of people who say they're very happy? And what you find with this $9 billion self-help industry on happiness is we're not seeing much change. And part of the reason is that we go with our gut instincts intuitively about how we think we can achieve happiness in our lives. And what I'm going to offer you are some of the psychological biases and obstructions that are getting in the way that you might not even be aware of. And by just by being knowledgeable about these psychological obstructions that exist in all of us, you can get better at achieving this thing called happiness. But we should probably start with the definition. So this is a very contentious area. People spend their entire careers just debating how we should define happiness. So this is from Sonia Leah-Bramirsky, Laura King, Ken Sheldon, Ed Diener. Many of us have just kind of felt like this. We can keep this simple. They're basically the most commonly accepted definition of happiness is 3 parts. One is that you have frequent experiences of positive emotions. You have infrequent experiences of negative emotions like anxiety, envy, guilt, shame, fear. And you have this cognitive element of happiness where you kind of give a thumbs up that life is satisfying, that life is close to your ideal, that when you think about the ideal way that your life could be lived, you're kind of getting close to that aspirational vision of what life is like. It's a mental judgment. And you put these 3 things together, and with this thing that we call happiness. Now, the most important thing, and I hope you bombard me with the questions in the Q&A, because honestly, I have Teflon-coated skin. I can handle as many detractors, and I love hostile audiences. So bring any question you want. I'm going to make a controversial statement here in the field of science, which is happiness should be studied subjectively. What that means is I can put you in an fMRI chamber and see what parts of your brain is activated when I show you pictures of your family, of your best friends, of your loved ones, pictures of the career that you want to acquire. If you want to be a veterinarian, you get some cute puppies and some cute ponies. And I can see basically is the left prefrontal cortex of your brain activated when you're exposed to these pictures. I would say that's the wrong level of analysis. It would light up in the left side of your brain, your prefrontal cortex compared to your right, but who cares? What matters is, do you believe your life is satisfying and you have an emotional life that is comfortable to you? Subjective. With this definition, we can ask ourselves, well, what do you get if you win the cortical lottery and you are a happy person? What do happy people gain? And there's been about, 45 years of research on this topic. We're just getting started, but we're learning a lot here. I'm going to tantalize you with a couple of facts. One thing we know is that happy people, when they are in the workforce, clients like them better, they're more likely to buy from them. Bosses like them better, they're more likely to promote them. When happy people kind of bring themselves to the workplace, they are more likely to throw themselves into their work. they're more engaged, they're more attentive, they're more productive, they're more creative. They experience more of these moments of flow, where they actually experience a moment in time where the activity they're doing is perfectly manicured to their skills. It's just a little bit out of reach, the challenge that they're facing. So they're fully engrossed, they're immersed, and they're not thinking about the past, and they're not thinking about the future. And in those moments, they experience joy, experience engagement, and they experience a feeling of vitality that they're alive. Now, I put an asterisk next to creative because the literature on creativity and happiness is a little bit more convoluted and nuanced. The positive emotions you experience as a happy person makes you more likely to broaden your repertoire of attention. You bring in more ideas, you can synthesize them, you could play with them, you can uncover them, you could flip them over, poke them, probe them, and that leads to more divergent thought. You make unusual combinations and you're more likely to be creative. But you also need some negative emotions that actually help you become creative, and that you're more likely to persevere and sell those ideas and try to influence people with a little bit of anxiety as well. This is called the dual process model of creativity. The positive and negative emotions operate differently in terms of being a creative accomplisher. Now, happy people make more money, but that's complicated as well. The data up to date 2021 shows that after you make about $75,000 in a family household, you don't see much incremental gains in happiness. Of course, this differs in terms of where you live. If you live in San Francisco versus live in Boise, Idaho, $75,000 goes a long way. We also know, thanks to work by Elizabeth Dunn at University of British Columbia, that how you spend your money can make you more likely to experience happiness. If you spend it on experiences, traveling, as opposed to buying, the latest clothes for your wardrobe, that's going to increase the propensity to be happy. If you spend it on, if you spend money as rewards for accomplishing your goals, that will increase your propensity to be happy. And if you spend money on other people versus yourself, despite the pain you think that might have, spending money on others, especially people you care about, seeing them pleased by this makes you a happier person. But that's not all the benefits you get. There's more. Happy people, the biggest, strongest finding out there is happy people can be distinguished from unhappy people by one single variable. They have closer, significant, meaningful, lasting relationships. It is the single greatest distinguisher between the unhappy and the happy. More likely to marry. When they're married, they're fulfilled. Just because you're married doesn't mean you're going to be happy. You're less likely to get divorced. You have more friends. You experience more intimacy with those friends by sharing information about yourself. You're more likely to trust people, and you draw in social support because of that. So you got people there that have your back during difficult times. You're more likely to be pro-social as a happy person, kind, compassionate. Spend your money on other people, which I just mentioned, only serves to increase your happiness further and sets up this nice cyclical loop. You're happy, you're kinder, you also spend money on other people, which makes you happier and kinder. To me, the most interesting findings about happiness is that you have a stronger immunological system. You actually are more resistant to the common cold when you're exposed to viruses. I bet I would put my money down that people that are happier are more likely to, when they get exposed to the COVID virus, they are less likely to have symptoms and have weaker symptoms compared to people that are less happy. Has not been studied yet. The data are still out in terms of the jury, but what we found is that Sheldon Cohen at University of Pittsburgh paid people $300 to live 2 weeks in a biosphere with a bunch of strangers. It sounds like a reality TV show for nerds. And what he wanted to do was answer the question, what makes people susceptible to disease and infirmary and mortality and morbidity? And what he found was that happier people are less likely, despite being exposed to the rhinovirus, to develop a cold. How he measured this is pretty disgusting. In one case, he just asked about people's symptoms, but he also had research assistants go into garbage pails, pick up the tissues out of the garbage pails, and weigh the mucus in those tissues. So you have an objective physical measure of symptoms, the actual weight of your mucus, and the subjective feeling of the symptoms that you report. And happier people are less likely to experience both. 28 years later, happier people are less likely to die from every type of possible illness or disease. 11 years later, people happier are less likely to be in a car accident and less likely to die in a car accident. And one of the reasons is they're more likely to wear their seatbelts. Pretty good. It's good to be happy. It's not just something that feels good, it leads to healthy outcomes. So this leads to the big, huge quandary, which is why we have this multi-billion-dollar self-help industry. It's easy to have happy moments. Now, I can't see you in the crowd, but I suspect your list has overlaps with mine in terms of what are the reliable sources of happiness for you. Maybe it's lobster, maybe it's unagi rolls, maybe it's surfing in the ocean, maybe it's seeing the sunrise, the sunset, maybe it's holding hands with someone that you love, maybe it's a nice warm hug from someone you actually want to hug from, Italian rainbow cookies. We have things that we know can bring us happiness in a moment. What's difficult for us as human beings is staying happy, staying at a high level that's pretty invariant to the vicissitudes and stressors of daily life. Why can't we stay happy? I'm going to give you a few of the mechanisms, but they really fall down into two categories. Is that we adapt to events, habituate to events is another way of saying it, and I'm going to call the other thing perverted emotional time travel. Is that we make decisions in the future based on how we think we're going to feel, and we are horrendous at this. So let me walk you through these psychological barriers to staying happy. So the first is what we'll call hedonic adaptation, which is just a jargony term to say that when we experience changes in our lives, they only produce a temporary impact and we get accustomed to the experiences rather quickly. And the way to think about this, I went to Kuwait before COVID. The niece of the ruler, they don't have a president, it's the ruler of Kuwait, invited me to give a talk on happiness. And while I was with them, they ended up having a huge arsenal of sports cars. Now, I've never driven a Lamborghini before, and most kids want to drive a Lamborghini. So the question would be, how long can you ride a Lamborghini before you are so accustomed to the joy of the experience that you don't care anymore and you're ready to get out of the car and do something else? The answer is not too long. A Lamborghini is amazing. It 0 to 60 in only a few seconds is a powerful machine. But after 2 hours of driving a Lamborghini, you have to ask yourself, how much do you really just love driving on roads, especially when there's traffic? You acclimate to the situation. It's joyful, it's intense, it's exciting, it's stimulating, it's interesting, it's intriguing, it's awe-inspiring, but it doesn't last that long. How long does it take when you get a dog before you realize that there's so many responsibilities that you underestimated how much the pain exists having a dog in relation to the rewards of having a dog? How long does it take you at an all-you-can-eat buffet where you were really hungry to start, or all of a sudden you wish that you never ate something in the first place? When we get exposed to novelty, we get a flush of positive experiences, and often some anxiety that actually only amplifies the pleasure of the experience. Hot foods, horror movies, roller coasters, but it's temporary. We adapt quickly to things. This is good, because if we experience loss, stress, strain, difficulty, we want to be able to adapt to get back into the mode of being able to think clearly, make sure we can complete our everyday routines, and get back to work of doing things. So in Germany, they've got this lifespan study of tens of thousands of people. And in this group of tens of thousands, they basically picked out those people that lost their romantic partner who died in the course of the study. And you got to think about this for a second. You spend your whole life dating people or interacting with people in hopes of finding the person you want to spend your life with. You find this person, you pair up, you share resources, you live a great life together, and then they die. It's one of the worst things that could happen to somebody. The question is, how long does it take for you to bounce back to your normal psychological functioning? So in this sample of tens of thousands of people in Germany, it took the year that people's romantic partner died and made that year 0 on the x-axis. And what you see here is amazing adaptation skills. For men, on the left, it took about 4 to 5 years in the aftermath of losing their primary romantic partner to bounce back and return to their normal psychological functioning. For women, half that time, only about 2.5 years, and they're right back to where they were. Now, that's another talk, another day, but women have coping skills when it comes to loss that is superior to men. The term that's been used, it's by Shelley Taylor at UCLA. She calls it tend and befriend. Everybody has a fight, flight, and freeze response to terror, to major stressors. But women have this additional bonus of a high level of tending and caring for people when they're stressed or experience trauma, and befriending and making friends despite the presence of trauma, loss, and adversity. And because of those extra coping skills, it's one of the reasons that women even adapt quicker than men to social loss. But it's not just losing your romantic partner that we're able to adapt so quickly. Unemployment. In the past year, there's been a large number of people in the United States that lost their jobs. And the research shows that it takes about 2 to 7 years to return back to your baseline psychological functioning after you lose your job. And one of the reasons for that, it tends to be worse for men. And one of the reasons for that is you now know that your financial and your social stability, your safety net is much, much more precarious and tenuous than you ever thought. And you don't ever return to that in the same way for 2 to 7 years later to actually recover. But you do recover from it, but it's a little bit difficult what happens there. But we do adapt to things. These are the extremes. But even these extreme events, we adapt. And because of that, it's hard for positive changes in our lives to have a lasting impact on us. There's another barrier to happiness, and the Truth Potato, I don't know if you're familiar with this website, they capture it best. There will always be people prettier and uglier than you. We do this really bizarre thing when good things happen to us. Let's say you get a salary boost. Let's say you get into the grad school of your dreams. Let's say you meet the perfect person that you want to date. Let's say you develop the perfect body from exercise and nutrition and good sleep hygiene. We do something is that we don't revel in our accomplishments. We don't enjoy and savor the good things that happen to us. We raise our standards. And so we're on this hedonic treadmill. Every time something good happens to us, we change our benchmark of what we compare ourselves to and who we compare ourselves to. So as we develop a more physically capable body and we get stronger and faster and wiser and more intelligent, we change the reference group that we compare ourselves to. So our happiness never improves because we're constantly changing who we increase the intensity of who we compare ourselves to. So this treadmill prevents us from ever staying at a high level of happiness. It gets in the way. And the reason is that we have a baseline level of happiness that we oscillate around. Every one of us has a certain level of happiness that is pretty stable month to month and year to year. The stability is impressive. It's about 80% stability over the course of a 3-year time span, which means that On average, no matter what happens to people, their happiness is very close to where it is year to year, and most of it is due to genetic variance at the population level. It's our baseline level of happiness that determines where we start from before something happens, before we approach our goals, before we fail at something, before we make mistakes, before we get rewards in our lives, before we go fine dining, before we go surfing. We have a baseline level of happiness, and this is just the cortical lottery. Some people win it and they get all those benefits I mentioned before, and some people lose it and they start at a depressogenic level, an unhappy level, a pessimistic level. And it's good to know where your baseline is because it gives you a starting point in terms of comparing yourself to older versions of yourself and thinking about how you want to change and how you'd like to act differently, how you'd like to live differently in the future. You can't get away from your baselines. One more barrier so I can put you guys into a downward spiral, and that is perverted emotional time travel. Basically, we are horrendous at predicting how we're going to feel in the future, and we base almost all of our big decisions on how we're going to feel in the future. It is a quandary that we need to escape if we're going to be happier at a high level and sustain that high level. So let me give you two examples of this. One is called psychological immunity neglect. It's actually a really cool term. We neglect how resilient we actually are and how good we are at dealing with setbacks. There was a study of people who had unprotected sex in the 80s and 90s or were exposed to viruses during a blood transfusion and were at high risk for HIV and AIDS. And the question was, what was your willingness to go get tested? A positive test would mean that you had HIV. And then what would happen if you found out that the results were positive and you have this disease, or if it's negative, and you could take the sigh of relief that you don't have it. So when they ask people, if this test is positive, what's going to happen to you? People say they're going to be depressed, they're going to be suicidal, they're going to hate themselves, they're going to have regrets that they ever did a blood transfusion, that they ever had unprotected sex, and they expect their entire life to be one of despair and despondency. And they ask people, what if it ends up being negative? They say, oh, if it's negative, I am going to be the most religious person, the most spiritual person. I'm going to go to church, synagogues, and mosques on a weekly basis. I'm going to be the kindest person. I'm going to give 10% of my salary to charity. I will protect people from bullies. I will never be a bystander if bad things happen. I will be the next Mahatma Gandhi. And then you see what actually happens. And when you actually see how do people respond when the HIV test is positive, what you find is they get a dip. Their psychological well-being takes a hit. More depression, more anxiety, more loneliness, more sense of isolation. But only 2 weeks later, they start crawling back up to their baseline level of happiness. Not at all what they predicted. The speed to which they recover, the psychological immunity, they underestimate their powers to bounce back. And for those people that have a negative test that said they're going to be the next Martin Luther King, the next Mahatma Gandhi, doesn't really happen. They feel really good, sense of relief and equanimity for a couple of weeks, and they get right back to where they were before. They're mean, they yell at their dog, they scream at their kids, they get into unnecessary fights with people on the road, they have road rage, and they're just like they were before a few weeks later. We underestimate how this psychological immunity occurs in our lives, but we make decisions based on how we think we're going to feel. Organ donors. So when you ask people, listen, would you like to meet the person that gave you a kidney, that gave you a heart transplant? It's the reason that you're alive. Do you want to meet the family that helped you? avoid death. Now, invariably, most people, if I remember correctly, it's about 80% of people say absolutely. They're going to walk through the door. We're going to hug. We're going to cry. They're going to be my new best friends. We're going to get a necklace where half of the heart will be on my necklace and half the heart will be on their necklace. We'll spend every Thanksgiving together. I'm going to call them all the time. And then you observe what actually happens. For those people that never meet their organ donor and people that do meet their organ donor, this is the pleasures of uncertainty. People think that certainty will give them the most pleasure, meeting that person that changed their life. And what you find is it's a great moment. It's a Kodak moment. It's the kind of thing you watch at the end of the nightly news of these are good things in the world. There's a big hug and there are a lot of tears. But after a few months, you realize you go back to your busy life, your social calendar, and normally that new person can't fit in there, and you go back to the way you were. But the people that never met the person that saved their lives, gave them a bladder, kidney, a lung, a heart transplant, you ask yourself, what kind of freaking crazy, benevolent world do I live in that people don't even want to get credit? They're going to stay anonymous. They don't even want to meet me. They don't want points, like social points for this. Don't they want to like burn off karma and have like a good afterlife? You don't adapt to that. The pleasures of not knowing who donated an organ change you dramatically. We see this. Economists have studied people. They can't get over it and they become kinder, more generous people. We make this mistake all the time of choosing certainty, and in positive events, often uncertainty leads to more intense positive experiences that have a greater and more enduring impact on our lives. But because of perverted emotional time travel, we underestimate this and forget to do this. This is a barrier to us experiencing happiness. So we adapt to events easily to change, and that's why we don't get happier. We have a perverted emotional time travel. We make decisions based on how we're going to feel in the future, but we're not good at making those decisions because we neglect how resilient we are, and we neglect the pleasures of uncertainty. And we have this hedonic treadmill. When good things happen to us, we just raise the bar and the standards, so we stay in place in terms of our happiness. So how can we break through these psychological barriers and become happier? We've discovered how. Two of the most effective interventions for increasing happiness is gratitude interventions and kindness interventions. Now, for one of the gratitude interventions is on a daily basis, or just you journaling, you journal the things that you're appreciative of, people that benefacted you and provided positive experiences in your life. You attribute the good events, the good experiences to other people. And the question is, if you did this every day, kept a journal, will this increase your happiness? And it's a very interesting finding. So compared to a bunch of college students who don't do anything. So the average college student over the course of a semester, their happiness goes down. And you can see this with the control condition. Those people that 3 times a week journal, write in their journal, who are they grateful to? What are they grateful for? Talk about the positive things that happen to you 3 times a week, their happiness goes down. But if they only do it once a week, they experience a high level of happiness. You would think that if something works well, if you do it more often, it would increase your happiness, but it's not the case. The reason is that when you journal 3 times a week, 4 times a week, 5 times a week in a gratitude journal, you run out of people to thank. And you start thanking the same people. My mom, my best friend, my mentor. Next day, my mom, my mentor, my best friend. And as you end up running out of people to thank and running out of positive events to write in that are varied and novel, you start to think, there's not that much in my life. There's not that many people to thank. But when it's once a week, it's a day of variety. It's a disruption in your routine, gratitude day, where this is the day I'm going to pay thanks. to all the benefactors in my life. And if you do it too much, it becomes a homework assignment. You need the variety. The variety busts through the barriers of hedonic adaptation and the hedonic treadmill. And we find the same thing for kindness interventions. If you're asked on a daily basis to be a kind person, it depends how much variety there is in terms of whether it will increase your happiness. So there's a low variety condition where basically people are given a list of 15 kind things they could do: holding the door for people, writing a thank you note, writing a note of appreciation to people in your life, whether it's a barista or a waiter or waitress. When you are told, pick 3 things on this list of kind acts and do them daily, you experience no better increase in your happiness than doing nothing. In the high variety condition, you're said, basically, here's a list of 15 kind acts. Choose whatever you want to do every day. Like, put your own combination together. When you're given that autonomy and that variety, those people who are acting more kindly on purpose experience more happiness. Without the variety, increasing your acts of kindness does nothing to improve your happiness. There's also effort. I mean, this is obvious for anyone who goes to the gym or who has attempted to diet or made any kind of behavioral change in their lives. If you don't devote consistent effort to actually try to think of people, like dig deep, like are there people in your childhood that you haven't properly thanked before in a gratitude intervention? In terms of optimism and thinking about expectancies for future positive events, think carefully, put a lot of deliberate effort into domains of life, in leisure, in work, in friendships, in romantic relationships. The more effort you put into these activities, the more likely to increase your happiness. If you don't put effort into these happiness interventions, what you see here is you don't even show an increase in happiness. It actually declines a little bit. It's one of these things that Aristotle calls uncommon common knowledge. We know this, and yet so many people buy self-help books on happiness and or apps on their phone to meditate and be mindful. But if they don't put consistent effort in, they're not going to get happy just by glancing and devoting just a small bit of attentional space. You got to go full throttle. One more way of crushing through this hedonic treadmill and this hedonic adaptation is you need fit. These activities, happiness-inducing activities, have to match you. They should be personalized. So when you read scientific studies on happiness, you should think, how do I apply this to my life? Your particular personality, your goals, your lifestyle. And what we find is that after taking a personality test, people that have an activity that matches their personality, optimistic people doing an optimistic intervention, people that tend to savor positive experiences with photographs and journaling, doing a gratitude intervention, they get the more benefits from it. If you're a highly sociable person, you probably do better for happiness doing an intervention that involved increasing the positivity of your social interactions. Fit is important. And this is something that scientists aren't going to know. You have to match the science to your personality. So let me take you into one space as I bring this home. And I think this is kind of the most tantalizing part of this talk, is thinking about the psychology of time, which I think gets ignored way too often when we think about happiness. We've been stuck, trapped in our houses with the same roommates, the same family members and friends for a year. And a lot of us are really excited to go do something. If you're like me, one of my big interests is traveling. I don't really like cruise ships, but some of my family members do like cruise ships. There are 3 phases of every positive event in our life. And I want you to think really carefully about this. They all have different influences on our happiness. There's the anticipatory phase, which is you are imagining what it's going to be like to do the thing that you're planning to do. There's the online moments where you're actually in the midst of the activity. You're on the cruise ship, you're in the pool, you're drinking the margarita, you're meeting some strangers, you're meeting some cool people. People are giving you compliments. And then there's the post-mortem. After it happens, you look at the photographs, you tell stories, you create a narrative about the event. What we find is that the moments during a positive activity, being in the moment, have less of an influence on your general happiness than your post-mortem, the narrative that you weave about events, the stories you tell yourself. This is why you should be taking photographs, keeping journal entries, and describing your life, because it helps you hold on to these experiences, so it actually has an influence on who you are and what you're going to become. And we should also be careful to think about the anticipatory period. It's one reason I don't do surprise parties for any one of my friends or family, is because I want them to know that in 3 weeks or a few months from now, there's going to be a party and they can enjoy and relish imagining what it's going to be like, thinking about it, relishing it. You deprive people of that joyous moment, of those moments, if you don't give them the anticipatory period. Now, there's another element to this I've been thinking a lot about, which is, as we seek variety in our lives, so many channels of television, so many streaming stations, so many people we could socialize with. People now use dating apps. They have an infinite, paralyzed number of possible partners. There's something that's lost. We'll never have another Johnny Carson, who was the late night talk show host before my generation. We'll never have another Seinfeld, which is the biggest show when I was in college, that millions of people are watching at the exact same time. We'll never have another Dan Rather and Connie Chung, where almost the majority of the nation was watching the news at the same time, 7 o'clock every day, as we now have an infinite number of websites and channels. As we seek variety in our lives and have as much uniqueness, we become lonelier because we don't have these shared experiences that bridge people together across moral divides. Liberals, conservatives, different races, different sexes, different genders. There were time periods where, with the lack of variety, everybody was getting the same cultural moments together, and we're losing that. So again, the psychology of time, of everyone not having the same shared experiences across millions of people, it does something to affect the fiber of society that's worth thinking about in terms of being happy people and a happy society. In the nature of time, I'm going to skip this, so pretend this didn't happen. Everything I'm talking about, the nature of happiness, the barriers of happiness, how to overcome these barriers, it all starts with an intention of what is the smallest unit of change you can engage in now to improve your happiness. If you want to get fit, it starts with one push-up. If you want to increase your physical health, it's dental floss, one tooth. If you want to be happier, it's having that singular interaction, just reaching out, purposely calling someone on the phone and telling them that you miss them, purposely writing a text saying you had a really good time when you hung out with them yesterday, telling people what you like about them. Small units of behavior are the building blocks that create this foundational thing that we call happiness. So that is the psychology of happiness in a nutshell. And I am looking forward to your questions, your criticisms, any connections and thoughts you have. And you will be the first group ever to be exposed. This is my brand new book that will be coming out this August. So thank you for letting me spend 40 minutes. Look forward to talking to you guys in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for your talk and for letting us see your book cover. That's really exciting. We're going to dedicate the rest of the time to some questions from our audience. So if you're out there as an attendee listening, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our first question, though, comes in from a student who asks, in relation to your surprise party example, is it possible that the post-mortem of the party not living out their expectations would trump the happiness gains they get from knowing about it beforehand? wouldn't it only be better for the party not to be a surprise if the party itself does end up being a success?
That is such a good nuanced question. I'm so glad you asked it. And I love the pushback. So the quick answer is yes. That's right. Like this, everything that I've spoken about today is very contextually driven. And we can dive in greater details of how this fits in an exact situation. So if we could make reasonable predictions about how that party is going to turn out, knowing their social life, knowing their cast of characters, maybe they have friends that often get drunk, and when they get drunk, they get unruly and reckless and aggressive. Maybe they've got like a bunch of ex-girlfriends and boyfriends, and you imagine them being there at the party at the same time. In that case, the greater predictive power you have, you can make an informed decision. Do I front load this in terms of having a surprise, or do I backload this in terms of letting them have the full anticipatory experience, knowing that I think this is going to be a killer kick-ass party that happens there? And this is a perfect example of, here's what the science says on average, and now let's adapt it based on our understanding of ourselves and other people. Fantastic question.
Next question comes from a student who asks, what is most missing in the study of happiness?
Well, there's a lot, and I'm glad you're going for the gaps. That tells me you should be going to grad school if you're not in grad school already, because this is what you really want to be searching for. You get caught in. I speak for 40 minutes, and you get caught in with all these new concepts and terms, and you'll buy in, but you actually want to step back as well and say, where are the gaps? One of the big gaps is cross-cultural knowledge. Everything I said, is an implicit assumption. I'm talking about the world, but the thing is, I've spent months in Sri Lanka, I've spent months in Vietnam and in Cambodia, and I've spent months living in Iceland. And I can tell you that when you're in these different parts of the world, that the things that I just spoke about are going to have some differences, and we need to explore that much more. For example, we know that people that live in Asian countries, particularly East Asian countries like Korea and Taiwan and Japan, their most pleasurable experiences are low energy. On average, contentment, equanimity, tranquility, stillness, just walking through a field of grass and feeling the breeze against your body. Whereas in the United States and in Israel and in Canada and New Zealand, in these countries, people's most preferred emotional state is high energy. States of intrigue, states of awe, states of being inspired. And so just there, we know culturally, the emotional states that are preferred differ. And then you can ask yourself, what are the downstream effects in terms of how to construct a workplace, how to construct a classroom, knowing that certain people prefer these low emotional states and certain people prefer these high pleasant emotional states. So this cross-cultural work is definitely where there's a huge gap.
Our next question comes in from another student who's asking about your mention of the cortical lottery, our genetic baseline of happiness. They want to know, to what extent is this actually genetic versus based on early life experiences? And in any case, what can be done to shift that baseline?
Good question. I'm glad someone tackled this, because talking about genetics is always a little bit controversial. So we have enough twin studies. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of people that have been studied for twins to separate genetics and shared life environments and people's individualized life trajectories that is different from your twin. I mean, I have twins and I am a twin, and I can tell you is that you have a lot of shared experiences, but there's also the unique things that you pursue that your twin's not there. Whoever's your best friend has a huge impact from age 13 onward in terms of your social network, your peer group, in terms of taking you to a path of potential delinquency, a path of pursuing high achievement outcomes, and everything in between happens there. But because we have this data on twins, we can say very confidently that at the population level, the greatest influence of the three bins, unique experiences, shared environment in your household, and genetics. Genetics is the big driver of happiness, but genetics is not destiny. And one of the things that we've learned over the past 30 or 40 years is epigenetics, which is that certain life experiences turn off and on certain genes. So you might have a genetic predisposition for having major depressive episodes, but perhaps with living in a place with sufficient sunlight, with your genome, that being exposed to the sun and having that vitamin D enter your system turns off those genes and actually makes you less likely to be depressed. But if you were living in Minnesota or in Alaska or in Norway, that you have the genetic predisposition to have a major depressive episode more often. So we're still learning about this, how environments and genes interact together. And with that knowledge is that despite having a strong genetic predisposition, just even some of the psychological skills that I was mentioning in this talk, that we can override our genetic code. You should feel like a sense of agency despite the fact that happiness is highly genetic. Good question.
So towards the end of your presentation, you talked about how there are fewer and fewer commonalities amongst all people, talking about how there will no longer be a Seinfeld or a Johnny Carson. Do you see anything emerging in the near future that bridges the cultural / moral divide that's widening?
Damn, Chris, you're hitting right now, I got a $1.5 million. We're studying how to bridge the moral divides between the races, between reds and blues, and just kind of try to fix this cultural drift that's happening right now in society. I have mixed feelings. I have mixed thoughts about this. Part of me feels is that there is a big loss of we're losing a broader cultural umbrella that binds us all together at a national level. And this goes not just our country, but other countries as well. At the same time, there's such beauty and precious value that like everyone is finding their peoples, right? Online and kind of in the world where you can find your niches. You can find people that have Harry Potter tattoos in a small group, and you find like hundreds of people that are in there. You could find people that basically love the smell of carcasses, and you'll find them. There'll be hundreds of people online. And the fact is, if it ends up being that you like to be awake and moving around the world at nighttime, even though you don't work, during the day, like in the night is when you're alive, you'll find your peoples. And I think there's something beauty about, there's never been a greater time in history for diverse niches of people to find their partners in crime. So these two cultural strings are happening simultaneously. We're losing these broad shared experiences, but everyone is getting these great opportunities for the sense of belonging and the sense where they can be their unique, personalized selves. So I don't know how to put those into a formula, what to say about society. I would say I have a hopeful view of society. I do believe that one of the things that I hope we're moving towards is less obsessiveness of likability that social media is pulling us to do now, right? In terms of seeking likes, seeking kind of social attractiveness points, presenting ourselves in a way to get the most positive feedback, and to be simultaneously very niche oriented and very other oriented in terms of expanding our circle to include people that don't think like us or look like us. And I think there's gonna be some tweaking in technology that's gonna allow you to bounce between these two windows of interacting with other human beings.
Another question from a Claremont McKenna student is whether there's any correlation between the number of social connections that one has and their level of happiness, as opposed to just the qualitative factors of those relationships.
Good question. So there's definitely a tipping point here. In general, the quick answer is the quality of your social ties are much more important than the quantity, and yet society really pushes for quantity. So if that is the only thing you take away from anything I've said, it's an important one. We know that you only need 2 to 3 close friends and really only one best friend, and you can be maxed out in happiness very easily. This isn't like a small minority of people. You only need 2 to 3 close friends. And I think that's really an honest, hopeful message for people to have in a world where, people have, I could just, once I leave here, I have counts, I have numbers that tell me how many connections I have. And it could feel lonely knowing that you only actually understand the lives of 10 of 4,000 people that you interact with online. And so I think it's really useful to recalibrate your thinking about social relationships to that. Who are the 2 to 3 people in your inner circle? I call them my wise counsel, the people that I can share anything with. They can tell me anything and I'll take it to the grave. And then knowing that they're out there, I don't need to walk around trying to win people's affections. And there's a real empowerment of walking around knowing that I don't need to make friends and I can just be who I am. And I wish the same of everyone who's listening right now.
So before we conclude, do you have any final remarks?
The thing I would say well, first of all, thank you so much for listening. I know that there's a million things to do. There is something cool and special about having things happen live because something can go horribly, horribly wrong while I'm talking. So thank you for sticking this out. I would just say, take managing your psychology very seriously. I think we spend a lot more effort about our physical fitness. We put a lot more effort into how we present ourselves socially, and we don't put sufficient effort of how we manage our psychology. And I hope that some of these terms and concepts will be sticky for you, and that you realize that you don't get to acquire a fulfilling life in an instant. It's these small little building blocks that you invest in over the course of time, and just take it easy, take it small steps, and reach out to me anytime. Now that you have actually heard me talk, feel free to reach out, and I hope to see you guys sometime soon in person.
Well, on behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Professor Kashdan and to all those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be a week from today on Tuesday, April 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific. Documentary filmmakers and CMC class of 2012 alums, Zach Ingracie and Chris Temple, will discuss their film, The Undocumented Lawyer, and the role of documentary filmmaking to provide perspective into the U.S. immigration crisis. Thank you and have a good evening.